So back in 2013, this incredibly haunting piece of audio just totally gripped the internet. What started out as this really bizarre, unsolvable digital puzzle actually evolved into something profoundly, well, tragically human. Let's dive right into this highly cinematic explainer because we are going to trace the web's most mysterious song from the dark corners of YouTube all the way to a deeply heartbreaking reality in a war zone.
Okay, I want you to picture this for a second. It's 2013, you're just endlessly scrolling through the depths of YouTube. You know how it goes. And suddenly you stumble across this viral track. You don't understand a single word. You have absolutely no idea what the lyrics mean. But literally the second you hit play, the music and this voice, they just grab hold of you. It carries this incredibly heavy, almost unexplainable emotional weight that just settles right in your chest. It feels like an anchor. And that visceral reaction, that's exactly what millions of people experienced. Which of course brings us to the ultimate question we're answering today. What is the real secret behind the internet's most mysterious song?
Section 1. The Internet Music Mystery.
To really understand the answer, we kind of need to look at the phenomenon itself. The track we're talking about was uploaded under a couple of different names. You might actually know it as For Hawwa and Amina, or maybe under the title Struggling for Nirvana Through. But for anyone listening back in the early 2010s, it was just this absolutely captivating enigma. I mean, it was completely shrouded in darkness. There was zero context, no artist name, no country of origin, absolutely no explanation, just the audio. It was basically a giant puzzle missing half its pieces, and it drove the internet absolutely crazy. First, you had this totally unknown language. Some people were guessing Arabic, others were sure it was Persian. Then, you had an unidentified, heavily distorted singer, a totally cryptic meaning, and this undeniably heavy, creepy atmosphere. The comment sections were just exploding with wild theories. But honestly, that complete anonymity was exactly what made it so irresistible. Nobody had a clue, and the idea spread like wildfire.
Section 2. What is Witch House? Right, so before we can actually solve the mystery of the voice itself, we have to talk about the deeply unsettling music that made the song go viral in the first place. People categorize this track as Witch House. If you haven't heard of it, it's this very specific dark electronic music microgenre. And unlike typical electronic music that, makes you want to get up and dance, Witch House does the exact opposite. It uses incredibly slow tempos, these heavy earth-shaking bass lines, and vocals that are pitch-shifted down so low they sound almost ghost-like. It doesn't lift you up, it pulls you down with this really intense, palpable sense of dread. It is, quite literally, the sound of melancholy. It gives off this heavy horror movie background vibe, pulling a lot from hard wave and dark ambient influences. And here's the crazy part. Even without understanding a single word of the language, those heavy beats and distorted vocals communicated this profound sense of isolation and anxiety. It spoke this universal language of sorrow that just instantly clicked with listeners everywhere.
Section 3. The Sacred Maldivian Madaha.
So for years, that dark internet track was the entire story. But then, listeners from the Maldives actually stumbled upon the audio, and what they revealed? It completely shattered everything the internet thought it knew. The contrast here is it's super jarring. The internet saw this as a dark, creepy techno track meant to give you the chills. But the shocking reality? Those vocals weren't from some horror soundtrack at all. They were actually a sacred, traditional Maldivian spiritual poem. The juxtaposition is just wild to think about. The internet essentially took something deeply holy and turned it into an underground electronic club track. To really get our heads around this, we need to understand a term called madaha. A madaha is a highly spiritual, poetic form that comes from the Maldives. It's meant to be deeply reverent. It's used to praise the divine or to really seriously reflect on life, death, and God. So, yeah, this was never, ever meant to be a spooky viral sensation.
The poem itself was spoken in Divahi, which is the official language of the Maldives, written right to left in what's called the Thana script. And because Divahi has these really profound Arabic and Persian cultural influences, if you just do a simple, literal English translation, you lose so much of the emotional depth. The words carry this massive weight that goes way, way beyond just a direct translation.
Section 4. Pinky's Tragic Final Words.
Now that we know this was a deeply spiritual poem, we really have to ask, who actually wrote it and how on earth did it end up on YouTube? I'm going to slow things down a bit here, because the core of this mystery is just incredibly tragic. The man behind the voice was named Hassan Shifas, a young guy affectionately known to his friends as Pinky. But Pinky wasn't recording a track for some music producer. He was trapped in the middle of the Syrian civil war. This wasn't a studio recording, it was a farewell prayer. It was literally the final thoughts of a dying man, recorded in a brutal war zone right before his death.
When we look at the actual translations of what he was saying, it just breaks your heart. He begins with this deep introspection, saying, "Are there no words here? Think." It's such a moment of somber empathy. We're listening to a man facing the horrific reality of war, questioning his own ability to even find the right words to describe the end. It's the literal sound of helpless introspection in the face of absolute devastation.
And then we finally get to the origin of the song's famous title. He says, "Amina and Hawwa are no longer in my life." These aren't just random names that sounded cool. This is Pinky's devastating personal grief over the loss of his loved ones, likely his own children. When you realize that the title, For Hawwa and Hawwa, isn't some edgy artistic choice, but a father's agonizing lament, the entire track just takes on a completely different, profoundly heavy meaning.
He then transitions into this massive philosophical summary of the human experience, saying, from dust to sperm to life to dust. In just a few words, he basically captures the entire cycle of existence. And you know, this deep spiritual reflection on life and death is exactly why the internet, not understanding the language, mistakenly labeled the track Struggling for Nirvana. I mean, it was a spiritual struggle for sure. It was a final attempt to find peace before the end.
Section 5. The Anonymous Remix. Okay, so we know who recorded it, and the heartbreaking circumstances of where he died. But how exactly did the dying prayer of a Maldivian man in Syria become a witch house track on YouTube? Well, the surreal journey follows a really twisted timeline. It starts in a lonely, incredibly dangerous room in Syria. Somehow, and we still don't fully know how, that deeply personal audio file is intercepted or found by an unknown entity. It's then uploaded to YouTube by this totally anonymous user going by the name Mr. Aduhani, but only after it gets heavily remixed with that dark, witch house electronic beat. From there, the YouTube algorithm just takes over, and it becomes a global viral phenomenon. And to this day, the true identity of Mr. Aduhani remains a complete mystery.
Section 6. Art, Grief, and Immortality. This whole story brings us to a really heavy, incredibly fascinating philosophical debate. We are basically left looking at two deeply conflicting perspectives. On one hand, you have to ask, was this a disrespectful exploitation? I mean, someone took a dying man's incredibly private, sacred prayer, completely stripped it of its holy context, and turned it into an internet curiosity for millions of strangers to consume. That is a very valid concern for his family and friends. But on the other hand, was this actually a beautiful tribute? Because of that remix, Pinky's final words didn't just disappear into the rubble of a Syrian war zone. His voice gained this unexpected immortality, crossing borders and languages to touch millions of hearts all around the world.
What we're ultimately looking at here is the multiple lives of a single piece of creation. It's wild to think about. The exact same audio exists as a sacred Maldivian prayer to those who know its origins. It exists as a dark techno track played in underground European clubs. And, most importantly, it exists as a dying man's final heartbreaking testament. It literally took on completely different lives, entirely dependent on who was listening and what context they had.
Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to consider. When a creator's most private moments are released into the world, does the art lose its true meaning, or does it find a powerful new life that we could never have predicted? So, the next time you're listening to a mysterious song and you feel that heavy emotional pull, remember the story of Pinky. Remember that behind the beat, there might be a very real human life, a tragedy, and a legacy just waiting to be understood. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning what you hear, and I'll see you next time.